The scream came out of the horse barn just as the roof took fire, and before the men in the yard could cross themselves, Don Alonso de Serrano was already running barefoot through sparks and smoke, shouting for the woman everyone once mocked as the wrong bride. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will know how a proud widower of Guanajuato risked his name, his estate, and nearly his life for the one woman the town swore should never have crossed his gate. The night smelled of burning straw, hot pitch, and terrified animals. Horses hammered their hooves against the stalls hard enough to shake the planks. A stable boy fell to his knees, coughing black soot. One of the ranch hands kept yelling that he had heard her voice from inside, then heard nothing at all. Alonso did not stop to think. He tore at the half-barred door with his bare hands until the skin split across his knuckles. "Open it!" he roared. "If she is in there, I want her out alive!" No one in that yard had ever heard him speak like that. Not after the death of his young wife, not in disputes over land, not even when armed men from the mines had once tried to bully him over water rights. But that night his voice sounded like a man who had already decided what mattered more than pride. And if you had stood there under that shower of sparks, watching the richest house for miles lit up like judgment itself, you might have asked the same question the servants would whisper for years after. How did it come to this? How did a landowner raised on rank, bloodline, and obedience come to battle fire for a woman sent to him by mistake? A woman the town had laughed at before she ever spoke a word. For that answer, we have to leave the blaze behind for a moment and return to Guanajuato in the year 1788. When the dry season laid dust over the hills and silver fortunes still shaped men's souls. Alonso was 32 then, a widower of 3 years, living on a broad estate of stone courtyards, mesquite shadows, and old habits. He had inherited it from a father who made his money in the Veta Madre before trading the darkness of the mines for wheat fields, cattle pens, and respectable silence. His late wife, Leonor, had died after a fever took hold of her not long after she lost their only child. Since that burial, the house had become orderly and joyless. His mother, Doña Mercedes de Serrano, believed she knew the cure. A proper young lady from Mexico City, fine hands, soft voice, clean family line. A bride chosen through letters and old connections, sent by a merchant widow who claimed the girl was modest, graceful, and perfectly suited to restore warmth to the main house. Mercedes repeated it so often that even the servants began preparing for a woman they had never seen. Fresh linens were aired, the blue room was opened, the silver was polished twice. Then, near the end of September, an old coach rolled into the courtyard under a cloud of red dust. The driver climbed down first, stiff with road miles. The footman reached for the door. The household watched from the steps, from the balconies, from half-hidden kitchen windows. When the latch lifted, the wrong bride stepped down. If this opening has you with me already, subscribe and stay close, because the moment her boots touched the stone, the whole fate of that house began to change. What the household saw in that open carriage doorway was a woman no one had prepared their manners for. She came down without hurry, one gloved hand on the coach frame, the other gathering the dark blue skirts of a plain travel dress powdered red by the road. She was tall enough that even the mule driver straightened when she reached the ground. Strong through the shoulders, straight through the back, with skin that held the morning light like polished walnut, she looked less like the fragile city bride Doña Mercedes had ordered, and more like someone made to endure long roads, hard work, and the kind of looks that try to cut before a word is spoken. Her hair was braided close and hidden beneath a wrapped cloth. Her face was serious, not timid. And on her left wrist, tied beneath the sleeve, there was the faint shape of a small keepsake she kept close to the skin. The old coachman cleared his throat, dust caked in the folds of his neck. "Begging pardon, Don Alonso. The young lady Inés could not travel. Fever took her 2 days before departure. Doña Eulalia said the journey was paid, the mules hired, and this woman—" He hesitated there because every servant in the courtyard was listening. This woman was sent in honesty, not disguise. Her name is Salome. That was when Doña Mercedes let her fury be heard. She did not come down from the gallery. She stood above them in silver-gray silk, one hand on the iron rail, and said the words so coldly that even the pigeons under the eaves seemed to go still. I asked for a bride, not a provocation. Then she signaled to a maid, who hurried down with a small velvet purse that gave a hard little clink as it was held out. Take this. Hire a place in the next coach to the city. We will say there was confusion. Now, some insults strike like open palms. Others arrive smiling, well-dressed, and with money in them. This one belonged to the second kind. Salome looked at the purse, then at the woman above, and did not reach for it. Her chin held high against the town before the town had even gathered. I was not sent here to trick anyone, Senora, she said, and her voice was low, deep, steady. If your son wishes me gone, I will return before noon, but I do not take coins to disappear. The maid froze with the purse in her hand. A stable hand snorted and then swallowed it. One of the younger girls by the kitchen door covered her mouth. In a house where rank usually ended every argument before it began, the air changed all at once. Alonso felt it too. He had expected awkwardness, maybe disappointment, maybe a day of uncomfortable explanations. He had not expected this woman to stand in the middle of his yard like a carved pillar while his mother tried to buy her absence. Nor had he expected the jolt that ran through him at the sight of such plain courage. It angered him, not at her, but at the ugliness of what had just been done in his name. So he stepped forward before anyone else could speak. You will put that away, he said to the maid, never taking his eyes off his mother. Then, to Salome, with the whole household listening, you have come a long road under my roof. You will be received with courtesy under it. Doña Mercedes went white with disbelief. Alonso! But he was already offering the traveler his hand. For the first time that morning, something flickered in Salome's face. It was caution, the kind that comes from a life where kindness sometimes arrives wearing the mask of a trap. Still, after one long breath, she placed her hand in his. From the upper gallery, his mother said in a voice that promised war, Then let her sit at your table tonight, and let us all see what else has arrived with her. That promise of war hung over the house all the way to supper. By evening, the main dining room had taken on the stiff chill of a place where everyone meant to behave, and no one meant to be kind. Beeswax candles trembled in the silver holders. A roasted hen gave off the smell of garlic, charred skin, and cloves. But even that warm scent could not soften the room. Salome had been shown to a guest chamber at the far end of the inner corridor, with a wash basin of cool water, a narrow bed, and a crucifix above the wall niche. She cleaned the dust from her hands and face, tied back the loose edge of her sleeve, and came down when called with the same calm she had carried into the yard. Servants stared. Doña Mercedes did not invite her to sit at first. She only watched, as if hoping the woman would betray coarse manners without needing help. Alonso solved that silence himself. He pulled out a chair and said, You are a traveler in my house. Be seated. It was a simple courtesy, but his mother heard the challenge inside it. During the meal, the questions came dressed as conversation. Where had she been born? Near Cordoba, on a sugar estate. What family had sent her? None that claimed her loudly. Who taught her to speak so carefully? Life, she answered, and the widow in Mexico City she later served. Her mother had died when she was 8, in the crushing labor of the mills. After that, she had learned to keep her back straight, her hands useful, and her tears private. She did not tell the story like someone begging pity. She spoke plainly, and that plainness unsettled the table more than sobbing would have. Doña Mercedes tapped the stem of her cup. And Doña Eulalia thought such a history suitable for this house? Salome lifted her eyes. Doña Eulalia thought your son deserved honesty. The spoon in one maid's hand slipped against a plate with a bright little clang. Alonso almost smiled. His mother did not. Yet he noticed something then that mattered more than any sharp answer. Salome never once tried to make herself smaller. No bowed shoulders, no shrinking voice. She sat there as if her worth had been settled long ago, and anyone too blind to see it was merely late. Later, when the trays had been carried off and the house muttered behind doors, she followed the smell of masa and wood smoke to the kitchen. That was where warmth truly lived. Copper pots glowed in the firelight. Beans simmered low in a clay pot. A thick woman with strong forearms and tired, intelligent eyes turned from the stove and looked her over once, from head to boots, in the way of someone measuring trouble honestly. "I'm Tomasa," she said. "If the front of the house bites, the kitchen usually doesn't." It was the first welcome Salome believed. Over a bowl of atole and a heel of sweetbread, Tomasa told her enough to be trusted. She had come there 20 years earlier with a baby in her arms and no husband beside her. The muleteer she married died on the Zacatecas road before the child could know his face. "People stared then, too," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Not for the same reasons, but scorn has 100 costumes, and it always thinks it is original." That drew from Salome the smallest laugh of the day. Bit by bit, more came out. In the city, she had carried letters, sorted linens, mended seams, and learned things no one meant to teach her. She had sounded out words over greasy cookbooks after midnight. She had matched names on folded correspondence with the names spoken aloud in the parlor. She had taught herself in secret, because knowledge, once taken into the bones, could not be snatched away as easily as wages. Tomasa stopped with the ladle halfway to the pot. "You can read?" Salome gave one cautious nod. From the dark corner near the back door, where neither woman had realized anyone was standing, a young male voice whispered, "Then, Señora, could you teach me?" The boy stepped into the firelight as if he expected to be struck for asking. He could not have been more than 16. Thin wrists, patched shirt, hair still damp from hauling water at the back cistern. He kept his cap crushed in both hands and looked at Salome with the hungry, embarrassed hope of someone who had wanted one thing for a very long time and had learned to ask for it softly. "My name is Benito," he said. "I know my prayers by sound, and I can count mules, sacks, and days' wages, but I can't read what's written for me. If you truly know letters, Señora, I'd work twice over to learn." Tomasa's face changed at that. Some women hear a request and think first of trouble. She heard the old ache inside it. "Close that door before the drafts kill the fire," she muttered to the boy, though her voice had gentled. Then she looked at Salome. "You need not answer tonight. In this house, anything unusual grows legs by morning." She was right. Already the servants would be telling each other that the traveler from the capital had talked back to the mistress and dined beside the master. Add secret reading to that, and the whole place would buzz like a disturbed hive. But Salome had lived too long among locked things to be careless with a key once seen. She broke off a corner of sweetbread, dipped it in the warm atole, and thought for a moment. "Before dawn," she said at last, "if you are truly willing to rise before the bells, bring a stick and smooth earth." Benito's whole face lit in one startled flash. He nodded so hard he nearly dropped his cap. At first light, while the manor still slept behind shuttered windows, Salome crossed the yard with mist clinging low over the ground and the smell of wet adobe rising from the night's coolness. The estate looked different before people remembered their rank. Kitchen smoke was only beginning to curl from the chimney. A mule snorted in its pen. Somewhere beyond the storehouse, a rooster tore the silence in two. Beneath a great old oak near the workers' quarters, Benito waited, just as promised, barefoot and shivering, with a smooth branch in his hand. That morning she wrote the first letter in the dirt. Not with ceremony, not like a schoolmaster before a slate. She crouched, pressed the stick into the brown earth, and drew a simple shape. "This one first," she said. "You learn the sound, then the mark, then the way words begin to open." Benito repeated it under his breath, lips moving with fierce concentration. Again, again. By the time the sun rose over the far ridge and turned the chapel cross pale gold, he had managed 3 letters and was grinning like a thief who had stolen daylight. What neither of them noticed at first was that they had an audience. Old Isidro, the estate's chief steward, had paused on his way from the granary with a ring of iron keys hanging from his sash. He had served the Serrano family so long that the servants joked he remembered the walls being built. He watched in silence, face unreadable, then moved on. A pair of laundry girls stopped with baskets on their hips. A teamster slowed his cart. From the long upper corridor, where the carved stone railing threw bars of shadow over the floor, Don Alonso stood in his shirt sleeves and saw the whole thing. He did not interrupt. He only stayed there longer than a busy man needed to. By breakfast, the lesson under the oak had become a whisper moving room to room. Some said the strange woman was filling heads above their station. Some said she was only teaching a boy his letters. Doña Mercedes, hearing of it while chocolate was poured into her cup, went still enough to make the maid's hand tremble. "First my table," she said quietly. "Now my peons." Before the morning was out, a servant came to Salome's chamber with a message from the master. Don Alonso wished to see her in the office at once, and on his desk lay the estate ledgers, opened to the July accounts. She found Alonso in the office with the shutters half open and the morning heat already pressing through the room. It was a man's chamber in the old colonial way, thick walls, dark wood, the faint smell of ink, leather, and dust baked by years of dry seasons. Account books lay open across the broad desk like sleeping animals with their bellies split. Beside them stood the estate administrator, Don Ramiro Velez, a narrow man with oiled hair, a careful beard, and fingers too soft for the authority he wore. He had the watchful look of someone who smiled often and trusted no one. Alonso was standing near the window, with one hand on the sill. "You said you taught a boy his letters," he began, "and my steward tells me you learned to read in the capital. I want to know how well." Ramiro gave a little laugh through his nose. "Surely, Don Alonso, we are not about to put Hacienda ledgers in the hands of a passing guest." Salome felt the insult in that word and let it pass by her. "If I cannot make sense of them, you lose nothing," she said. "If I can, then perhaps you learn whether your books are as clean as you believe." That earned the smallest turn at Alonso's mouth. Ramiro did not enjoy it. He pushed one volume toward her with the air of a man laying a trap he expects to admire in a moment. "Very well. July accounts. Repairs, feed, wages, lamp oil. Read what you can." The paper rasped under Salome's fingertips. The columns were cramped, the numbers slanted, the ink browned at the edges. Yet she had spent too many nights teaching herself from scraps and labels to be frightened by crowded pages. She bent over the ledger. Outside, a cart creaked over the yard stones. Somewhere in the inner court, a pigeon fluttered from the eaves. Inside that room, even Ramiro's breathing grew noticeable. She moved line by line, lips still, eyes steady. Then she stopped. Her finger rested on one entry. "This repair to the Noria," she said. 40 pesos. Ramiro folded his arms. "And?" She looked up. "It should be 25. Silence struck the room so quickly it seemed to ring. Ramiro's expression barely shifted, but a pulse leaped once in his jaw. "On what authority?" "On the authority of sense, for one thing. The wheel was patched, not rebuilt. And on the authority of memory for another. Yesterday, when I crossed the backyard, I heard 2 mulemen grumbling that the blacksmith had waited 3 weeks to be paid his 25. She turned one page back, then forward again. "The same hand that wrote this also inflated 3 smaller purchases. Nails, tallow, rope, each by a little." Little theft is still theft. Now, friends, this is where pride often saves a liar. If Alonso had been the sort of master who could not bear correction from a woman sent by mistake, he would have laughed and closed the book. Many men would have. But grief had hollowed him out in one way and sharpened him in another. He had become a man who listened when truth scraped. "Send for the blacksmith," he said. Ramiro took one step forward. "Don Alonso, this is absurd. A stranger glances at numbers and suddenly years of faithful service are in doubt." Alonso's voice turned cold. "I said send for him." By noon the smith arrived, smelling of iron scale and sweat, cap twisting in his hands. He confirmed the sum in a hoarse voice. 25 pesos, paid late, and with complaints besides. One of the yardmen, questioned after him, remembered the rope purchase too. Ramiro's neat little world began to fray before the dust had settled on the man's boots. Salome did not gloat. She only stood with her hands folded, watching the truth do its work. Alonso closed the ledger very gently. That gentleness frightened Ramiro more than shouting would have. "Leave us," the master said to him. The administrator went pale. "You cannot mean to judge my whole service on a handful of misremembered entries." "No," Alonso replied. "On all of them. Every page." And as Ramiro backed toward the door, he cast Salome one quick, naked look at last. The look of a man who had just understood exactly who had undone him, and who would not forgive it. From that hour on, the house did not settle down. It lurched. When a dishonest man is pulled out of the middle of an estate, he does not leave behind tidy emptiness. He leaves knots. By afternoon, those knots were everywhere. A wagon of maize meant for the workers' kitchens had been entered twice in one book, and not at all in another. Lamp oil for the chapel had been promised, but never delivered. 2 mule drivers swore they had not received the last part of their wages. In the storeroom, sacks of beans stood open with no tally marks on the wall. A crate of dried chilies had spoiled because someone forgot to move it off damp stone. The whole place smelled of dust, cumin, old paper, and rising temper. Isidro, with his ring of keys and his 30 years of habit, tried to restore order, but even he looked as though the floor had shifted under him. Salome did what people like her have always done when gentlemen discover chaos too late. She began where hunger would strike first. She went straight to Tomasa's kitchen. "How much grain is truly in hand?" she asked. Tomasa wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist and led her into the pantry. The room was cool and dim, lined with shelves of crockery, hanging garlic, folded cloth sacks, and clay jars sealed with wax. Salome counted with her eyes before she ever touched a ledger. 4 sacks of maize whole, 1 split at the bottom. Beans, enough for perhaps 6 days if stretched. Lard, low. Salt, fair. Dried squash, thank God, in better shape than the paper claimed. "Then we changed the order," she said. "Children first, men in the fields fed solid at dawn, lighter meal at midday, no waste from the master's table carried off to spoil, bones go to broth." Tomasa studied her for one breath, then nodded, as if accepting a command she had been waiting for someone sensible to give. My son said Salome had tied her sleeves back and was working beside the cook as if she had always belonged there. She measured maize with a wooden scoop, set aside the cleanest beans, sent Benito running with messages, and asked 2 older serving women which families had infants, which had sick elders, which laborers were away on transport. That was the thing about true management. It is not all writing and seals. It is knowing who will go hungry first if a number is wrong. The kitchen fires snapped under the comal. Steam fogged the low window. Outside, workers queued with bowls in their hands, and the muttering began to change. They still stared at her size. They still took in the deep color of her skin. But now they also saw that supper reached them on time because she had taken hold where others had fumbled. Even Alonso noticed the difference before night. He came in from the yard, smelling of horse leather and heat, expecting fresh complaint, and found instead a line moving steadily, children already fed, and Tomasa barking orders with uncommon peace in her voice. Salome was near the big table, checking portions with Isidro beside her and flour dust on one forearm. For a moment, Alonso simply watched. It struck him, perhaps for the first time since his wife died, that authority could look like this too. A woman in a hot kitchen, sleeves rolled, saving a household from embarrassment and hunger without asking anyone's permission. But while respect was beginning to gather in one part of the house, resentment was hardening in another. Late that night, as Salome carried a lamp back toward her chamber, she passed the office and heard low voices through the half-closed door. Ramiro had not yet been sent away from the estate grounds. He was inside with Doña Mercedes. The lamp flame trembled in her hand as she caught one sentence clearly, spoken in the old administrator's bitter hiss. "If he means to keep that woman here, Senora, then we must learn exactly who she belongs to." It followed Salome into sleep and met her again at dawn. She did not repeat it to anyone. A woman who has survived on other people's mercy learns early that overheard words are like sparks in dry grass. You do not stamp on them blindly. You watch the wind first. So she rose before the bell, washed in cold water that smelled faintly of copper, tied back her sleeves, and went to the kitchen as if nothing had changed. Tommaso was already grinding spices, Benito was whispering yesterday's letters to himself over a crust of bread, and the house beyond the service court was waking with all its usual sounds: pails against stone, mule harness creaking, chapel bell, a cough from the upper hall. Yet under it all there ran another rhythm now, tighter and meaner. People looked at her, then looked away too quickly. News had traveled. The dismissed administrator's shame, the missing accounts, the mistress's anger. And somewhere inside that tangle, the question of who she belonged to had already begun to grow teeth. Near mid-morning, Alonso sent for her again, though this time not to the office. He was in the outer yard beside a light carriage, glove in one hand, sun striking the dark gold threads in his waistcoat. "I'm going into town," he said. "The storerooms need fresh purchases, and half the merchants have become careless because they think this estate can be cheated in small amounts." His eyes rested on hers a moment longer than form required. "Tomasa says you know cloth, grain quality, and measures. Come with us if you are willing." It was a practical invitation. It was also something else, though neither of them named it. Doña Mercedes, hearing of the trip, objected at once. "You mean to parade her through Guanajuato now?" Alonso answered without raising his voice. "I mean to buy honest goods." That was the end of the discussion in words. In silence, the war continued. Town received them with noise, color, and poison. The market square shimmered under late sun. Ox carts groaned. Vendors shouted over heaps of limes, onions, peppers, pottery, ribbons, dried fish, cakes of piloncillo. The smell of hot dust mixed with frying lard and bruised herbs. Salome stepped down from the carriage beside the masa and felt the weight of eyes before the sound of whispering even reached her. Women at a chile stall looked her over openly. A cobbler paused with his awl in midair. 2 boys snickered and stretched on their toes to measure themselves against her height. One sharp-faced seller, old enough to know better and eager enough to be cruel, called to a neighbor, "So that is the bride from the capital." "Santa Maria." The gentleman ordered a dove and received a war horse. A few laughed, others tried not to. Salome turned slowly toward the stall, her chin held high against the town, the same way she had held it in the courtyard on her first day. "A war horse earns its keep," she said evenly. "Can the same be said for a loose tongue?" The laughter shifted then, and not in the vendor's favor. Tomasa barked out a laugh loud as a ladle striking copper. Even Alonso, standing by a bolt of linen with the merchant blinking beside him, let the corner of his mouth move. But mockery does not die because one woman answers well. It only retreats to gather company. Company was already on its way. Across the square, beneath the awning of a mule harness shop, a mounted gentleman had been watching the whole exchange. He was broad through the chest, clean-shaven, dressed with more money than taste, and he wore the self-assured stillness of a man used to being admired before he spoke. This was Don Julian Castañeda, owner of a neighboring cattle estate and son of a trader who made his fortune driving beef to the mining camps. He had come to town on business. He stayed because he recognized Anos de Serrano and because he could not quite believe what he was seeing beside him. He asked the harness seller, without lowering his eyes from Salome, "Who is that woman?" The man answered in a murmur, delighted already by scandal, and by the time Tomasa finished choosing spices, Julian had turned his horse toward the Serrano carriage with a smile that looked polite from a distance and dangerous from up close. Julian reached them before the driver could lift the last sack into the carriage. He dismounted with the smooth confidence of a man who had spent his life being welcomed before he earned it. His boots were spotless despite the dust. His riding coat smelled faintly of tobacco leaf and expensive pomade. He bowed first to Alonso, then to Tomasa with polite neglect, and only then let his gaze settle on Salome in the open, measuring way of men who believe every person has a price, a place, or a weakness that can be named by sight alone. "Don Alonso," he said, smiling as if they were old friends, "you come to town and do not send word. That wounds me." Alonso returned the greeting with courtesy, though not warmth. They knew one another by land, by trade, by the kind of social closeness that often hides rivalry under silk. Julian's smile shifted when he looked again at Salome. "And yet," he went on, "I see you have not come alone." There are moments when insult still has the decency to wear armor. This one arrived perfumed and gloved. Salome felt the people nearby pretending not to listen. A pepper seller leaned closer over his stall. A girl with a basket of oranges slowed until her mother tugged her onward. The square itself seemed to hold its breath with that vulgar delight towns have for another family's discomfort. Alonso answered first. "This is Salome, a guest under my roof." Julian lifted his brows. "A guest?" He drew the word out as if turning a coin to test whether it was false. "Then your household has become more interesting than rumor allowed." His eyes moved over her once more, too slow. "I had been told the lady expected from the capital was delicate." Salome met that look without dropping hers. "Then rumor traveled faster than truth." Tomasa coughed into her shawl to hide a laugh. Alonso did not smile this time. "We have purchases to finish," he said. But Julian was one of those men who take another person's refusal as an invitation to press harder. He walked beside them through the cloth lane, speaking lightly of cattle prices, road robbers, freight contracts to the mines. Under the words lay something sharper. By the time they stopped before the linen merchant, he had steered the talk exactly where he wanted it. "My mother asked after yours," he said. "She worries for her old friend. A widow's burden is heavy when her son delays marriage." He glanced at Salome. "Though perhaps delay has turned into improvisation." You could almost hear the sting land. Alonso's jaw tightened. "If you have business with me, say it plainly." "Plainly?" Julian gave a soft laugh. "Very well. A house with your name should be careful what spectacle it feeds the town. People are cruel. They make stories from anything unusual. A woman like this beside you." He let the sentence hang there, ugly in its own confidence. Salome spoke before Alonso could. "A man like you speaks as if the town's malice were weather," she said, "as if no one chooses it. If they make a spectacle, senor, it will not be because I stood in the sunlight. It will be because men keep pointing." That one struck home. Julian's face held, but something dark flashed behind his eyes. Alonso saw it. So did Tomasa. Some prideful men can be mocked and recover. Others cannot bear being corrected by the very mouth they hoped to diminish. The ride home was quieter. The market heat faded into the copper light of late afternoon. Wheels bumped over ruts and dry grass whispered against the carriage as they climbed back toward the estate. Salome sat opposite Alonso with bundles at her feet and Tomasa dozing beside the sacks of grain. Yet the air between them was far from still. At last Alonso said, "You did not need to answer him for my sake." She turned to the window first, to the hills burning red in the falling sun. "I answered for my own." He looked at her a long moment after that, and something in his face softened in a way she had not yet seen. But when they passed under the front arch and entered the courtyard, a groom hurried forward, pale and breathless, carrying news from the main house. Doña Mercedes had already sent a note across the valley. The man invited to supper that very night was Don Julian Castañeda. By the time the lamps were lit in the dining room, everyone in the house understood that supper had ceased to be a meal and had become a test. The long table shone under candlelight. The silver reflected yellow flames in broken streaks. Fresh bread steamed in a linen cloth, and the smell of roasted kid with cumin drifted up from the platters, rich enough to stir hunger even in a tense room. Yet tension has a way of ruining good food. Tomasa knew it in the kitchen. The maids knew it from the way Doña Mercedes changed her gown twice before coming down. Salome knew it from the silence that greeted her when she entered. And Alonso knew it from the sight of Julián already seated near his mother, looking perfectly at ease in a chair that had not been offered from affection, but from design. Doña Mercedes played the gracious hostess so carefully that the effort itself felt sharp. "Don Julián has honored us on short notice," she said, as if no one in the room understood why he had truly been called. "A house under strain should still remember its manners." Salome took her seat only after Alonso had drawn the chair for her again. That small act sent a flicker through the servants standing along the wall. Julián noticed it too. He noticed everything that could later be used. Conversation began in the usual safe places: road conditions, drought in the farther fields, mule prices, the quality of this year's wheat. Then, as such men often do, Julián drifted toward the wound he most wished to press. "I heard in town," he said lightly, lifting his cup, "that your former administrator left in some disorder. A pity. One never knows how much a household rests on loyal hands until they are gone." Alonso answered in a tone flat as stone. "Loyal hands do not steal." Julián inclined his head. "Of course, though I imagine it must have taken remarkable insight to uncover it so quickly." Doña Mercedes set down her fork with a soft tap. "Insight appears to bloom very fast these days." The insult floated there, dressed too finely to be denied. Salome tasted smoke, wine, and anger all at once. Still, her voice came steady. "False numbers are easier to spot than false courtesy, señora. They repeat themselves more clearly." Julián laughed once, low in his throat. "You do speak boldly for a woman whose place here is unusual." "My place at this table was given by the master of the house," she said. "If it troubles you, that is a burden you may carry yourself." Now, my dear listener, there are rooms where a line like that would have ruined a woman. In this one, it did something worse for the people who hated her. It made the truth visible. Because Alonso did not rebuke her, he did not even look embarrassed. He looked proud. And that was the moment his mother truly understood the danger. The rest of the meal never recovered its mask. Julián smiled too much. Doña Mercedes barely swallowed a bite. Alonso spoke little, but his eyes kept finding Salome's. And each time they did, something passed between them that no one else at that table could control. Later, when the servants cleared the last plates and the hall emptied of footsteps, Salome crossed the upper corridor on her way back to her chamber. The night air slipped in through the open arches, carrying the scent of dry earth and jasmine from the courtyard below. She might have gone on unnoticed, if not for the low murmur from the small sitting room beside Doña Mercedes's apartments. The door was not fully shut. Inside, Julián was speaking, his voice stripped now of all supper politeness. "You see it yourself. If you leave matters to tenderness, you will lose him." A pause. Then Doña Mercedes, colder than before, answered, "Then tell me plainly what must be done." Julián did not hesitate. "We begin by finding out whether that woman is free at all." Salome did not sleep much after hearing that whisper through the half-closed door. The night dragged on with every small house sound sharpened by worry. A shutter tapped once in the wind. Somewhere below, a mule stamped in its stall. The last of the candle by her bedside bent low and gave off that faint, sweet smell of hot wax before dying. She lay awake, staring into the dark, one hand resting over the small keepsake tied beneath her left sleeve, and weighed what to do. Tell Alonso at once, and risk sounding like a woman who listened outside doors? Keep silent, and risk giving schemers the time they needed. By dawn, she had chosen caution. Caution. There is a difference, and women like her learn it young. She found Alonso alone later that morning in the shaded arcade overlooking the inner court. He had a cup of bitter chocolate untouched beside him, and a folded letter in his hand. Below them the fountain basin glimmered green, and the wet stones smelled cool despite the climbing heat. He looked tired, more than tired, perhaps, wounded in the private place reserved for sons who finally see what their mothers are willing to do. "You knew she invited him to wound me," he said quietly, before Salome could speak. "I did not believe she would do it so openly." She answered with care. "Proud people often prefer open wounds. They heal slower." That drew from him a short breath that almost became a laugh. Then he looked at her properly, and the moment changed. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the town, for that table, for every eye that thinks it may judge you because you crossed my gate." Salome leaned one shoulder against the column, the stone cool through the cloth. "If you begin apologizing for every cruel mouth in Guanajuato, senor, you will have no time left for the harvest." "Then let me speak only for my own house," he replied. "You should not have had to defend yourself there." She held his gaze. "And yet I would again." The courtyard water went on trickling between them. A pair of swallows flashed under the eaves. He did not answer at once, because he was looking at her the way a man looks when something in his life has ceased to fit its old name. If you have ever watched respect begin turning into something warmer, you know it is rarely loud at first. It lives in pauses, in the way one person remembers the other's words after the conversation is ended, in how the air itself seems to listen. Their quiet did not last. Doña Mercedes came into the arcade with her skirts whispering over the tiles and stopped at the sight of them standing there together. Her face sharpened. "Alonso, a word." He did not move away from Salome immediately, and that small delay made his mother's nostrils flare. "If this concerns last night, say it here," he told her. "Very well," she said. "This woman's history is a fog, and you behave as if mystery were proof of virtue. You know nothing of her bonds, her obligations, or the claims that may follow her." Salome felt the sting of each word, but kept still. Alonso's voice cooled. "I know enough of her conduct to compare it with the conduct around her." Doña Mercedes turned to Salome then. "And you? Have you brought papers, names, any witness who can swear where you stand in the law?" Salome answered honestly. "I brought myself. I was sent openly. I have hidden nothing." "That," said the older woman, "may prove to be the gravest thing of all." Before Alonso could answer, hoofbeats sounded from the front yard. Fast, purposeful. Isidro crossed the court below and looked up with a troubled face. "Don Alonso," he called. "A rider has just left from Don Julian's estate road, headed east with letters." Somehow, without being told, Salome knew those letters had her name inside them. After Isidro's warning, the whole day seemed to tighten around one invisible thread. Alonso gave no sign of panic before the servants. That was his habit. Men raised to command large houses learn early that fear spreads faster than fire if the master gives it a face. But he sent Isidro down at once with 2 trusted riders and quiet instructions to learn where the messenger had gone, to whom the letters were addressed, and whether coin had changed hands along the road. Then he turned back to Salome, and the hardness in him softened just enough for honesty. "If they are asking about your past," he said, "I need to know everything you can tell me. Not because I doubt you, because they will twist whatever they find." They spoke that evening in the old orchard above the lower fields, where the pears grew stubborn and small in the dry soil, and the leaves gave off a dusty green smell under the cooling air. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, leaving copper light on the chapel dome and long blue shadows over the furrows. Salome stood with one hand resting on the rough bark of a tree and told him what she had not told anyone in that house in full. Born near Córdoba, mother dead when she was 8. Years of labor, errands, and silent watching before the city widow took her into service. "I learned to read because words were always being used over my head," she said. "I wanted at least to know when they were about me." Alonso listened without interrupting. It was one of the reasons she had begun, against her own caution, to trust him. Most people listened only until they found a place to judge. He listened the way a thirsty field takes rain. "Were you ever bound to anyone?" he asked at last, and the care in the question mattered as much as the question itself. Salome drew a slow breath. "Bound by hunger, yes. By fear, yes. By paper?" She shook her head. "Not that I know of. No one ever put a document in my hands. No one ever called me purchased." Her voice lowered. "But people in my position are often kept from knowing what has been said over them. You understand?" He did, more than she expected. "My father used to say men of property mistake records for truth because records flatter them," Alonso murmured. "A lie with a seal is still a lie." For a while neither spoke. Crickets had begun in the grass. Somewhere below, a cart axle cried out and then went silent. When Salome shifted her sleeve, the small bracelet of carved seeds at her wrist caught on the cuff. Alonso glanced down. "You always wear that?" "It was my mother's." She touched it with 2 fingers, almost unconsciously. "It is the only thing of hers I have left." He looked at the little circle as though it were something holy and fragile. "Then keep it close," he said. "Whatever comes." Now, my dear listener, love rarely announces itself with trumpets in stories such as this. Sometimes it arrives as a man asking one more question than courtesy requires, because he cannot bear to leave a wound half understood. Sometimes it arrives as a woman answering that question honestly, when every lesson of her life has told her not to. By the time they returned toward the house, lanterns had been lit in the lower yard. Isidro was already waiting under the arch. Dust streaked his boots to the knee, and his face told them the riders had not returned empty-handed. "The courier rode hard toward the capital road," he said. "Stopped only once, at the Castañeda outpost, and he carried 2 letters, one for a lawyer in the city and one for the widow in whose service Doña Mercedes says you once lived." Salome felt the ground tilt inside her, though she did not move. Then Isidro added the part that made Alonso go still. "The lawyer's clerk was heard boasting in the tavern before sunset. He said Don Julián is gathering forged bond papers and paid witnesses." The words hit the 3 of them differently. Isidro took them like a man who had seen enough of the world to know that lies often arrive better dressed than truth. Alonso took them with a stillness that looked calm only to anyone who did not know him well. Salome felt the cold of it first in her hands. Forged bond papers and paid witnesses. Men with land and coin did not need to prove much when they wanted a darker-skinned woman pushed down into silence. They only needed a clerk willing to write, a notary willing to look away, and enough pride in the right family to call it order. That was the ugliest thing about such schemes. They were never born from law. They only borrowed its coat. Alonso dismissed the servants from earshot and led Salome and Isidro into the office. The air inside was stale with ink and dry leather. He shut the door himself. "From this moment," he said, "nothing about your past is too small to matter. A place, a name, a paper, a promise spoken in front of anyone." Salome searched her memory as if it were a dark room and she had been ordered to find a lost needle in it. Córdoba. The sugar estate. Her mother's hands, cracked and always warm. The city household after, messages carried, linen counted. Nights learning letters in secret. But documents? Seals? She shook her head once. "If there were papers, they were never shown to me." Isidro cleared his throat. "That may not save them from inventing some." Now listen, this was no idle threat born from tavern gossip. In those years, all across New Spain, a person's freedom could rest on records they had never seen and names they had never been allowed to read. People of African descent who were born free or freed later often lived at the mercy of what some clerk had bothered to write down, or failed to. A proper family with influence could muddy a life with one false claim, especially if the person targeted had no father of rank, no husband, no rich kinsman standing beside her. The law, in theory, could protect. In practice, it often bowed toward whoever arrived with more signatures, more witnesses, and a better coat. Salome knew all that without naming it in legal language. She had lived it in smaller ways her whole life. "I can write to Doña Eulalia," she said at last. "If she answers honestly, she can say how I came into her service." Alonso was already nodding. "You will do more than that. You will dictate, and I will send my own writer before dawn." He pulled paper toward him and uncorked the ink. As he did, Salome noticed the steadiness of his hand. Only his jaw betrayed anger. She began with the widow's name, then stopped. There was one more thing. "My mother," she said slowly. "There was always talk, when I was very small, of something she would not part with, something she kept hidden even when others sold what little they had. I never knew what it meant." Her fingers moved to the little bracelet tied under her sleeve. Alonso looked up. "This?" She untied it for the first time since arriving and laid it in his palm. It was small, made of dark red carved seeds, worn smooth with years of touch, with a tiny metal cross gone dull at the edges. Nothing grand, nothing a grand lady would covet. Yet Alonso held it carefully, as if even he understood that poor people's objects often carry the weight rich families reserve for documents and estates. "My mother told me once," Salome said, keeping her voice even, "that some things are worth more hidden than displayed. She died before I learned why." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Isidro, who missed less than people thought, lifted his head toward the shuttered window. Hoofbeats. Fast. A messenger changing horses in the front yard. One of Alonso's riders had returned already. And when Isidro opened the office door to hear him, the young man came in dust-covered and breathless, with news that made Salome's stomach turn. The letter to the city widow had reached its road, but a second inquiry had gone farther east, toward Veracruz, asking after a girl from a sugar estate near Cordoba by the name her mother had once used for her. By the next morning, the threat had stopped being rumor and started behaving like weather. It pressed on every corner of the estate. Men lowered their voices when Salome crossed the yard. Two serving girls who had laughed with Benito over his letters now fell silent and moved aside too quickly, as if standing too near her might one day be used against them. On the whitewashed wall behind the washhouse, someone had scratched a single ugly word with a nail during the night. Tomasa scrubbed it off before noon with ash and water, jaw tight the whole time. "Cowards always write on the walls," she muttered. "They never carve their names beside the filth." Salome said little. She carried the hurt the way she carried everything else, upright, contained, with no gift of spectacle to those who wanted it. But inside Alonso's office, the matter had already grown larger than insult. If you want to understand how dangerous such a scheme could be in that time, you have to picture the world as it truly was. In late colonial New Spain, freedom did not always travel with a person in the clean way decent people imagine. A free woman of African blood could live honestly for years, work openly, move from one household to another, and still find herself trapped if the right men decided her past was uncertain. Records were scattered. Baptisms might be entered one way in a parish book, labor lists another way in a plantation account, and private contracts might sit folded in a chest no court would see unless someone powerful demanded it. That gap between living truth and written proof, that was where predators worked. They bought clerks, they paid for statements, they dressed greed as legal concern and called it order. So when Alonso sent a second rider toward the capital and a third toward the Veracruz road, he was not being dramatic. He was moving faster than respectable families usually bothered to move for someone of Salome's station. And that, more than anything, was what scandalized his mother. Doña Mercedes came to the office before dinner with her mouth set in a line thin as thread. "You are putting the name of this house behind a servant's uncertainty," she said. Alonso stood by the desk, both palms flat on the wood. "I am putting the name of this house behind the truth, wherever it leads." She turned to Salome then, her eyes sharp and tired and proud all at once. "If there is some forgotten paper somewhere, pray it exists. Because if it does not, good intentions will not save you." Salome met that gaze steadily. "Good intentions have never saved me, Señora. Only endurance has." That answer followed Doña Mercedes out of the room like a slap she could not return. Toward evening, Isidro brought in an old trunk from a disused storeroom, one that had belonged to Alonso's father and still held scraps of mining correspondence, freight contracts, and debt notes from years back. "If men can hide lies in paper," the steward said, setting the trunk down with a grunt, "then honest people had best learn to answer with paper too." Salome and Alonso spent an hour in the dusty room sorting brittle sheets by lantern light. Their fingers blackened with old ink. Mice rustled somewhere inside the wall. Every so often a paper name or date meant nothing. Then one small detail snagged her memory. An old name. Not the one she used now, but the one her mother had called her when she was very little, before the city, before Cordoba was only grief. She whispered it aloud. Alonso looked up at once. "That is the name the rider carried east?" She nodded, suddenly cold. It was near midnight when the first answer came, not from Veracruz, but from the capital road. The returning courier arrived with foam on his horse and a sealed note from Doña Eulalia's household. Alonso broke it open while Salome stood across from him, every nerve stretched tight. He read the first lines, then lifted his eyes slowly. "She says," he murmured, "that there may be one thing left hidden after all, something your mother once secured at terrible cost, and that she should have spoken of years ago." The letter changed the air in the room more than any threat had done. Until then, danger had been a thing men were preparing somewhere else. Ink drying on false statements, boots on roads, gossip hardening into accusation. Now it had become something personal and alive. Alonso read the note again by lamplight, while Isidro stood near the door and Salome remained very still across the desk, as if any sudden movement might make the words worse. The flame gave off a bitter smell as it bent in the night draft. Outside, the front yard had gone quiet except for the shifting of horses in the stable. "Doña Eulalia says," Alonso murmured, more to himself than to the others, "that when your mother died, not all the truth died with her. She believes there was a notarized declaration, one tied to your freedom." He lifted his eyes. "And she says she has searched for it before, but not thoroughly enough." Salome closed her hand around the little bracelet at her wrist until the carved seeds pressed into her palm. "Why would she keep such a thing hidden? Cowardice?" Isidro said plainly. "Or guilt?" He was not wrong. Many decent households in those years carried their sins folded neatly beside their linen. A paper that could protect one servant might also expose what had been done to another. People often chose silence and then called it prudence. Alonso took up fresh paper at once. "She must search again," he said. "Every trunk, every chest, every packet of old accounts and household contracts." Then he paused and looked at Salome with a gentleness that cost him something. "There may be more in this than a document. If she has delayed all these years, it is because the story tied to it hurts." Salome answered almost under her breath, "Then let it hurt. Better pain than ignorance." So the second letter was written before midnight, more urgent than the first. Alonso wrote in his firm hand, and Salome dictated what she could bear, that if there existed any declaration, any witness, any forgotten note from the Veracruz years, it must be sent at once. She did not ask prettily. She asked like a woman whose life might be weighed against forged bond papers and paid witnesses within days. When the wax seal was pressed, Alonso handed it not to a boy, but to his fastest rider. Then came the waiting, Waiting, my dear listener, is its own cruelty in stories like this. A blow you can brace for, a road you can ride, a man you can answer, but waiting leaves you alone with every memory you never finished understanding. The next day, Salome tried to keep to work. She went to the kitchen, checked stores with Tomasa, corrected Benito's letters under the oak, and oversaw the splitting of the cracked maize sack so nothing more would spoil. Yet her mind returned again and again to Córdoba, to smoke from the mill chimneys, to the ache in her mother's shoulders at dusk, to one night in particular she had not thought about in years. She remembered being very small, half asleep, watching her mother untie that same little bracelet and hide it beneath a floor mat before a man's boots sounded outside. She remembered tears on a face that had almost never allowed them. She remembered hearing one sentence she had never understood as a child: "If they take the paper, they take her." By late afternoon, that memory had turned her cold. She found Alonso near the lower paddock, where he was speaking with two field hands about water channels. The sky had gone pale brass with approaching heat, and the smell of crushed grass rose under the horse's hooves. She told him what she had remembered. He listened without interruption, then said quietly, "Then the paper was real." "Or she believed it was," Salome answered. "Either way, someone wanted it hidden." Before either could say more, a servant came running from the house, apron flapping, breath gone. "Don Alonso, rider at the gate!" It was not their man returning from the capital. It was a court messenger in town colors, carrying a leather packet sealed with the judge's mark. The court messenger did not remove his hat until the packet had changed hands. He stood in the front hall with road dust on his boots and sweat darkening the collar of his coat, one of those thin official men who carry other people's power and learn to keep their own feelings hidden. The leather packet bore the town seal in red wax, pressed hard enough to crack at the edges. Servants had gathered where they could pretend to be passing through. Tomasa stood at the back with flour still on her forearms. Isidro closed the door against the evening glare. Salome remained beside the carved table under the saint's niche, her back straight, her face unreadable. Only Alonso, breaking the seal with his thumb, allowed the silence to thicken before words came. He read once, then again, slower. "It is a petition," he said at last, and the sound of his voice made Tomasa cross herself. "Filed by Don Julian Castañeda before the district court. He claims this woman is being unlawfully retained here under false circumstances." Alonso's mouth hardened. "He alleges she is bound by prior service obligation, and that transfer papers exist." There it was. The lie had taken full dress now. No longer tavern bragging, no longer whispers in upper rooms. A formal claim, written in careful language, aimed like a knife at the softest place. Salome did not speak at first. She looked not at Alonso, but at the paper itself, as if staring hard enough might burn through ink into motive. "So that is how he means to do it," she said quietly. The messenger, perhaps uncomfortable under the weight of what he had delivered, cleared his throat. "There is to be a preliminary hearing in town in 6 days. The lady named in the petition is required to appear." Required. Such a cold, clean word for the possible theft of a life. Alonso folded the notice with far more care than he felt. "You will tell the court she will appear with counsel," he said. "And you will tell whoever sent you that this house contests every line of that claim." The messenger bowed, relieved to leave with his bones unbroken, and was gone before the last echo of the outer door had faded. Then came the true moment. Not the reading, not the seal. The true moment was what Alonso chose next, while every servant still breathed in the hall and his mother watched from the corridor with pale fury. He turned to Salome and said, clearly enough for all of them, "You will not face this alone." Now, my dear listener, that sentence matters. In houses ruled by rank, there are protections given in private and protections given in public. The first kind may be heartfelt. The second kind costs something. His cost had just begun. Doña Mercedes descended the stairs as if every step offended her.
You mean to tie your name to this scandal before the whole town? She demanded.
I mean to keep an unjust lie from swallowing an innocent woman, Alonso replied. And if the town must see that done, let it see. You know nothing yet of what may be found. Neither does Julian. That has not stopped him. The mother's gaze cut to Salome.
Misfortune follows people with hidden histories.
Salome answered before Alonso could.
Misfortune follows greed more faithfully, Senora.
That sharpened exchange might have gone on longer, but the estate had no patience left for noble quarrels. Trouble came from another quarter before the hour had turned. One of the field women arrived in the service yard carrying a child limp with heat in her arms. Then another came. Then another message from the workers' huts near the lower ditch. A sudden fever had broken out among the youngest children after bad water from a fouled barrel line. Their little foreheads burned. Their mothers were already near panic. Tomasa went pale. Isidro cursed under his breath. And because disaster has a cruel sense of timing, it chose that very night to force the whole household's attention away from paper and onto survival. Salome moved first. Boil every drop, she said, already turning toward the kitchen. Strip the cots in the old storeroom. Benito, run. Tell the women with clean hands to come. Tomasa, I need broth, salt, cloth, and every sound basin in the house. Alonso caught her arm for the briefest second. The court can wait until dawn, he said. But as she pulled free and headed toward the service wing, another rider came pounding through the gate from the Capitol Road, waving a packet above his head and shouting for the master. The answer from Doña Eulalia had arrived, and it was thicker than a letter. Before anyone could break the packet from the capital, the children had to be saved. That is the cruel way of life on large estates. Grief never arrives alone. It brings chores, smoke, fever, crying, and men asking for decisions while someone else is already collapsing in the yard. So Salome went where she was needed first. She crossed the service court at a near run with Tomasa beside her, the kitchen heat striking them like an oven door flung wide. Pots were already being dragged onto the fire, water sloshed in heavy basins. Benito, white-faced but quick, was tearing old linen into strips with his shaking hands. The smell of broth, ash, damp cloth, and panic filled the room. Women from the workers' huts crowded the threshold, each one clutching a child or begging news of another. Salome did not try to soothe them with pretty words. She gave orders.
Boil all drinking water. No one touches the ditch barrels. Move the little ones into the old grain room where the air stays cooler. Wet cloths for the foreheads. Broth in spoonfuls, not gulps. If a child has strength enough to cry, thank God for it.
Tomasa picked up the rhythm at once, barking names, sending girls running, shaming two frightened boys into hauling fresh wood for the stove. By lantern light, the old grain room became a ward of sorts. Cots dragged in, pallets spread, mothers kneeling on woven mats, little bodies flushed red under thin blankets. The walls held the day's heat, but the floor stayed cooler than the huts below. Outside, crickets sang as if the world were not balancing over dread. You see now why this woman could not be dismissed as some grand mistake from a marriage plan gone wrong. When a room fills with need, people stop caring about pedigree and start caring who can think clearly. Alonso understood that better than anyone by midnight. He came in carrying the thick packet from the rider, unopened still, because even he had not been able to pull her away from the fever room. His sleeves were rolled, sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. He had helped carry basins, ordered the clean casks opened, and sent for the priest only in case the worst should come. When he found Salome bent over a laborer's child, cooling the boy's wrists with a cloth and counting his breaths under hers, something in his face changed again. Not pity, something deeper and more dangerous than either. "Two of them have eased," she said without looking up. "The broth stayed down." Alonso nodded once. Then they lived through the night. For a moment, they stood very close in that cramped, hot room, while a child whimpered nearby and Tomasa stirred the broth at the door. It would have been easy, then, in some other kind of story, to turn away from the world and speak only of feeling. But this was not a world that permitted such luxury. The packet was still in Alonso's hand. The court notice still waited on his desk. Julian's lie still grew in the dark. When the worst of the fever broke near dawn, and the first mothers began weeping from relief instead of fear, Salome washed her hands in a basin gone pink with clay dust and sat for the first time all night. Her arms trembled with wearisome. Alonso crouched beside the bench and set the unopened packet between them. "We should read it now." Inside were several folded sheets, one sealed separately, and a letter in Doña Eulalia's own hand. It trembled with haste, even in the pen strokes. She wrote that she had searched more deeply after receiving Alonso's second plea. In a locked escritoire behind old trade receipts, she'd found mention of a declaration placed years ago with a notary, tied to Salome's mother and the child's status from birth. She had not yet found the original itself, but she had found something else. A private account of what that mother paid so her daughter would never be sold off or claimed. Salome read those lines once, and the room around her seemed to recede. Then Alonso unfolded the sealed inner sheet, scanned it, and looked up with shock he could not hide. "Your mother did not simply die, worn down by the mill," he said quietly. When Salome lifted her eyes to his, he placed the paper in her hand. Salome took the paper with hands still damp from the wash basin, and for a moment she could not make herself look down. The grain room behind her had finally gone quieter. A few of the children still whimpered in their sleep, but the worst of the fever had eased. Dawn was beginning to gray the high window, and the air smelled of broth, wet linen, and that heavy tiredness that comes after a night of fear. Alonso remained close without crowding her. Tomasa, at the door, had the good sense to turn her face away and give the moment privacy without leaving it unguarded. Salome unfolded the sheet. The handwriting was not her employer's. It was older, harsher, likely copied from some earlier account. She began to read. The words struck in pieces at first. Her mother had not simply been worked into the ground and buried like countless others. Years before her death, when Salome was still a child small enough to be carried asleep from one room to another, a sale had been proposed. Not of the mother, of the girl. Separated. Transferred with other labor, her mother refused again, and because poor women's refusals were rarely tolerated, punishment followed. Not the sort that leaves clean lines fit for court language, but the sort that breaks a body over time and teaches silence to everyone watching. Yet, even hurt and watched, she had managed to secure something precious, a declaration, witnessed, notarized, a statement that the child was born free through the mother's own purchased condition and could not be lawfully sold away. A freedom letter bought by a mother. Salome had to stop reading then. The page blurred, because some grief does not arrive as grief the first time. It arrives as correction, a whole life suddenly made to stand in a different light. The bracelet at her wrist, the hidden floor mat, the words she half remembered, all of it shifted at once. "She bought me time," Salome whispered. Alonso heard her. "She bought you more than time." The letter went on. After securing that declaration, the mother had hidden knowledge of it from almost everyone, even later from the child herself, because papers could be stolen more easily than memory if the wrong overseer learned where they were kept. At some point, according to Doña Eulalia's account, the original had been entrusted through an intermediary to a notary's archive with references copied into a private household ledger. The widow had found the reference. She had not yet recovered the original document, but now she knew where to keep searching, and she swore she had already sent a man to the notarial office named in the old entry. Salome lowered the sheet very slowly. All her life, she had believed her mother died only tired, only beaten down by labor and heat and bad luck. Now she understood that the woman had died fighting. Fighting not with a blade, not with witnesses, not with noble kin, but with the little means left to someone the world had decided did not matter. Work. Endurance. Hidden paper. A tiny bracelet kept close because it marked what had been paid for. Tomasa crossed herself at last. "Santa Madre de Dios," she murmured. "That poor woman." "No," Salome said, and her voice had changed. It came rougher now, stronger too.
Do not pity her. Honor her.
Alonso looked at her then as if he had never seen her more clearly. He had watched her command kitchens, expose theft, face insult, and stand awake through a fever night. But this was different. This was the core of her, the place where dignity had been planted before she was old enough to name it. He reached out, paused, then rested his hand lightly over hers on the folded paper. "Listen to me," he said. "Whatever that court receives from Julian, whatever lie he purchases, whatever my mother permits by silence, I will not let them drag you into that room, undefended." Salome met his eyes.
And if the original is gone?
Before he could answer, Isidro entered fast, breathing hard from the yard.
"The rider from the capital has sent another message ahead," he said. "The notarial office has been opened, and the clerk there claims someone arrived before our man, asking for the same document by the child's old name."
The news drove the last softness out of the morning. If someone had reached the notarial office first, then this was no longer a matter of waiting politely for truth to surface. It had become a race against men who meant to bury it. Alonso rose at once from the bench beside her. The tired tenderness that had filled the grain room only moments before tightened into purpose. "Saddle my bay mare," he told Isidro, "and send for Father Robles. I want a written statement from the women whose children she kept alive last night, from Tomasa, from anyone who can attest how she came here and how she has conducted herself." Salome looked up sharply.
"Testimony of my work will not prove freedom."
"No," he said, "but it will prove character in a room where men will try to strip you of all else." Tomasa, hearing this, planted both hands on her hips.
"Then they will hear from me first."
Her voice was rough from smoke and sleeplessness.
"And if the court has ears worth a single bean, it will hear from every mother in that grain room too."
By noon, the estate had become two houses at once. In one, paper moved, statements were taken. Isidro dictated names and dates to Benito, who wrote with slow, fierce care under supervision. Father Robles arrived sweating under his black collar, blinking at the smell of boiled linens and broth still hanging in the service wing. And before the day ended, he had written and signed what he saw with his own eyes, that the woman under dispute had preserved order, charity, and life under that roof. In the other house, fear moved. Salome felt it in the glances, in the pauses when she crossed a corridor, in the way Doña Mercedes remained behind closed doors for hours, and then emerged with red-rimmed eyes and colder lips. Toward evening, Alonso found Salome alone by the old oak where Benito had learned his first letters. The ground there was dry, scattered with fallen leaves and the fine dust of late season. Far off, thunder muttered over the hills, though no rain yet came. She had come for air, or perhaps for distance. He knew enough not to ask which. He stood beside her, not touching, both of them looking toward the workers' huts below. "I can still send you away before the hearing," he said after a long silence. "North, perhaps, to relatives of mine near Querétaro, until this filth collapses on its own." Salome turned her head slowly. "Do you believe it would collapse?" He did not answer at once. That was answer enough.
"Then no," she said. "I have spent my whole life moving when other people decided my presence cost too much. I will not run now, while that man writes lies and your mother helps him sharpen them." Her chin held high against the town, though this time the town was far below them, and the defiance was for something larger. "If I leave, they will say he was right. If I stay and lose, at least I lose standing." Alonso looked at her then with something so open in his face it made the air between them feel charged. "You would rather be broken in public than hidden for your own safety?" "I would rather be myself in danger," she said, "than protected into disappearance." For one heartbeat, then two, he simply watched her. Whatever remained unsaid between them was no longer mist or possibility. It had weight now. History. Choice. Risk. He took one step closer. "Salome, But the moment broke on the sound of hooves in the lower yard and a shout for the master. A rider from town had come early, before the appointed day, carrying formal copies of Julian's claim and the list of those prepared to testify. The clerk read the names aloud in the hall where everyone could hear. Most meant nothing. Then came one that struck her like a stone. An overseer from the Córdoba district, a man old enough to have known the sugar estate where her mother fought for that hidden paper. When the clerk finished, he added one more line with bureaucratic calm. The claimant also petitions for immediate temporary seizure of the woman's person, pending judgment. The petition for temporary seizure did exactly what Julian intended it to do. It made the house feel invaded before a single stranger crossed the gate. That night, no one slept deeply. Lamps burned later than usual in the office. Isidro sorted statements into careful bundles. Father Robles sharpened his quill and copied names again in a steadier hand. Tomasa sent Benito to bed twice, and twice found him creeping back to listen near the door. Salome sat in the small chapel for a while, not praying with grand words, only breathing in the smell of old wood, tallow, and dry flowers, with her mother's bracelet looped through her fingers. She was tired enough for her bones to ache, yet sleep would not come. Somewhere beyond the walls, men she had never met were deciding how to rename her life. Before dawn, that threat arrived in boots. A town bailiff rode in with 2 armed escorts and a folded warrant. The sky was still slate gray. Roosters had only just begun. Their horses snorted white in the chill, and the metal on the men's belts flashed when they dismounted. Servants opened shutters one by one. Workers paused in the yard with water buckets in their hands. The whole estate seemed to draw a breath and hold it. Alonso came down the front steps, still buttoning his coat, Isidro at his shoulder, Father Robles behind them. Salome followed as far as the hall threshold and stopped there, visible enough that no one could say she hid. The bailiff bowed stiffly. By petition entered yesterday, I am instructed to take custody of the woman named Salome, pending the hearing. Alonso did not touch the paper at first. Read it aloud. Some men mistake courtesy for surrender. The bailiff made that mistake for half a minute. Then he began to read, and halfway through the order, Isidro interrupted. That line is incomplete. He stepped closer, tapped the lower margin, and looked to Father Robles. No clerk's second attestation. No notation of immediate risk or flight. The claimant requests seizure. The judge has not fully granted it. The priest took the sheet, adjusted it toward the light, and nodded once. The bailiff's ears reddened. Alonso's voice went quiet, which was when it became most dangerous. You will not drag a free woman from my house on an incomplete order drafted in haste by another man's pride. The escorts shifted their hands near their belts. Tomasa muttered a saint's name. Salome stood very still, her heart pounding so hard she felt it in her throat. This was the line, then. The moment when the whole lie tried to become flesh. After a tight exchange that seemed to scrape the air raw, a compromise was forced. The bailiff, unwilling to retreat empty-handed, and unwilling to provoke a public scandal beyond his authority, agreed that Salome would appear under Alonso's personal surety at the hearing by midday instead of being taken like property at dawn. It was a thin mercy, but a mercy still. Then, when it seemed the worst insult of the morning had already been delivered, another rider came in hard from the Capitol Road. He nearly fell from the saddle in his hurry. Dust masked his face. His horse was wet to the flanks. He carried no elegant packet this time, only a folded cloth case tied with cord and sealed under wax. "From Doña Eulalia's man," he gasped. "From the notarial archive." Every sound in the yard seemed to stop. Alonso broke the cord. Inside lay 3 copied leaves and 1 official extract bearing registry marks, old but legible. Not the lost original itself, but a certified notation that years earlier a declaration had indeed been entered on behalf of a child born free through her mother's purchased condition. A freedom letter bought by a mother, traced in the registry book by name, date, and notary. Salome pressed her hand to her mouth. Father Robles whispered, Thanks be to God. But Isidro, squinting at the final page, did not smile.
There is a problem, he said.
Alonso looked up sharply. Isidro pointed to the bottom margin where the archive clerk had added one line in hurried ink.
The notary who entered it is alive, he said, and he has already been summoned by Julian's side.
The single line in the margin kept all hope from settling too easily.
A registry extract was precious, yes. It proved that the declaration had existed, that Salome's mother had secured something real and lawful, something no man should have been able to wish away with a shrug and a purse of coins. But if the very notary who entered it had already been reached by Julian's people, then truth itself was walking into danger. A frightened old official could forget. A bribed one could shift his memory. A vain one could decide his reputation mattered more than a woman he had never seen since infancy. That was how the world often worked. Paper alone did not save the poor. Paper had to survive the mouths of men. So the ride to town took place under a sky that looked washed with pewter. Salome sat in the carriage beside Alonso, with the cloth case holding the registry extract wrapped twice and hidden inside a plain grain ledger. Isidro rode ahead, Father Robles followed behind with Tomasa's written statement and the testimony of the mothers from the grain room. The horses smelled of sweat and leather. Wheels struck ruts hard enough to shake the breath in her chest. The road to town wound past dry fields, mule trains, and low chaparral, where even the birds seemed quiet in the late morning heat. Alonso said little. Once, when the carriage lurched, his hand closed briefly over hers to steady her. He did not let go at once. "You can still wait outside when we arrive," he said quietly. "My advocate can speak first." Salome looked through the dust-blurred window toward the distant church towers of Guanajuato. "The claim is against my life," she answered. "I will hear it with my own ears." That answer stayed between them the rest of the ride. The district building was already crowded when they reached it, simply severe. Thick stone, narrow windows, sun glaring white on the courtyard wall. Hawkers had drifted near the square just to catch rumor. Town women stood beneath shawls, pretending to discuss market onions while watching every carriage that arrived. Men from nearby estates leaned in doorways with their hats tipped back, eager for scandal. By then the story had ripened in public mouths. The proud widower, the towering outsider, the offended neighbor, the question of blood, status, and ownership. People will forgive theft sooner than they forgive a person who crosses a line they themselves were too timid to cross. Inside, the hearing room smelled of dust, ink, damp wool, and human curiosity. Judge Beltran sat at the front, with the hard, exhausted face of a man used to lies and unimpressed by any of them until forced to decide which one carried better paperwork. Julian was already there, dressed in dark cloth fit for church and war alike, his expression polished into injured dignity. Beside him sat a legal man with narrow spectacles and lips too thin to trust. On a bench behind them waited two strangers, and farther back, a gray-whiskered overseer from the Córdoba district, whose very posture made Salome's stomach tighten. She did not know him by name. She knew the type instantly. Men like that always smelled somehow of cane smoke and command. Alonso guided her to the bench beside his own counsel, and did so in full sight of the room. Murmurs rose, some of them ugly, some startled, some almost admiring. The clerk began with the petition. Words like transfer, obligation, household retention, disputed status. Clean words, dead words. Words that tried to make a living woman sound like cargo delayed at a gate. Salome kept her spine straight and her face composed, but inside she felt each phrase as a hand reaching where it had no right to reach. Then Julian's advocate rose and called his first witness. It was not the old overseer. It was a paid man from a roadside posting house, neatly dressed for borrowed respectability, who stepped forward swearing he had carried papers years ago, proving Salome had been entered under binding service and unlawfully passed between households. He spoke too smoothly, too ready, and as Alonso's counsel stood to question him, Judge Beltran leaned back, narrowed his eyes, and said, "Very well, let us hear how much this man truly knows." The room leaned forward as if it, too, wanted to see whether the lie would hold under daylight. Julian's first witness planted himself before the bench with the stiff dignity of a man who had rehearsed courage in private. He swore he had once carried transfer papers concerning Salome from one household to another, and that the matter had been discussed openly enough for him to remember it years later. His voice came smooth at first, too smooth. Alonso's advocate, Licenciado Herrera, did not rush him. That was the first mercy of a good questioner. He let the man grow comfortable inside his own invention. "You carried the papers yourself?" Herrera asked. "I did." "From where?" "From Veracruz." "To whom?" "To agents in the capital." "Which agents?" The man blinked, named one. Herrera wrote it down, then asked the month, then the year, then the road taken, then which toll post had been crossed, then whether the packet had been sealed in red wax or black. The witness answered quickly twice, slowly 3 times, and after that his certainty began to fray. Sweat appeared along his hairline. One answer pressed against the next in the wrong direction. He placed the journey in the rainy season, then described a dry road. He named an agent who, according to a shipping ledger Herrera had obtained, had been dead by then. He claimed the packet bore a private mark from a merchant house that had not yet existed under that style. A murmur moved through the room. Now, listen carefully, because this is how bought truth often breaks. Not with one dramatic shout, with dates, with details, with little things no honest memory fears. Herrera's voice stayed mild. "And who approached you, sir, to remember all this so faithfully now?" "No one approached me. I came of my own conscience." Herrera lifted one dark brow. "Of your conscience? After receiving no money?" The man's eyes darted, too fast, toward Julian's side. That was enough. Judge Beltran saw it. So did half the room. He sat forward and struck the table once with the butt of his pen. "Answer plainly." The witness swallowed. "I was compensated for travel." "How much?" asked the judge. Silence. "How much?" 10 pesos, he whispered. A woman in the back gasped out loud. Julian's advocate stood to object, but too late. The stain had already spread. Herrera pressed once more, and the rest came out in ugly pieces. He had not carried any original transfer. He had been told what sort of story to support. He had seen a copy of something after the fact in the office of Julian's legal man. He did not know if it was real. Salome sat perfectly still through all of it. Her hands did not tremble, but inside her chest something unclenched for the first time in days. Not relief yet. Relief was too expensive to spend early. Still, the first wall had cracked. Judge Beltran ordered the witness aside with open disgust. "This hearing is not a mule market," he said coldly. "I will not have purchased testimony paraded before me as law." Julian's face had changed color, though he tried to hide it by lifting his chin. Alonso did not look at him. He looked only at Salome, and his eyes said what proprieties still would not let his mouth say in public. "Hold steady. We are not done." Because they were not. Julian's advocate, shaken but not broken, rose with visible effort. "Your Lordship, if there has been confusion in one supporting witness, the central instrument remains. The bond itself was regularized before a notary." He turned, signaled toward the side bench, and called the name of the man from the archive. The old notary stood up slowly. He was smaller than Salome expected, with liver-spotted hands and a face like folded parchment. Yet there was something else on him besides age. Fear. Real fear. He clutched his hat against his chest,
glanced once toward Julian, and then very briefly toward Alonso's table where the registry extract lay waiting beneath Herrera's hand. Judge Beltran narrowed his eyes. "Step forward," he said.
"And tell this court whether your seal has been used honestly." The old notary needed both hands to steady himself on the rail before the judge. His collar was wilted with sweat. His mouth worked once before any sound came. Up close, he looked less like a villain than like one of those frail men who spend too many years serving paper and too few serving courage. Judge Beltran watched him with the patience of someone who had smelled rot already and now wanted to know how deep it went. Julian's advocate rose halfway, perhaps to coach by posture alone, but the judge cut him off with one lifted hand. "The court asked the notary," he said. "The court will hear the notary." Herrera placed the registry extract on the table where everyone could see the seals and margin marks. "Do you recognize the registry hand?" he asked. The old man swallowed. "Yes." "Was there entered, years ago, a declaration concerning the free condition of a child born to the woman named in this record?" A pause. Then, very faintly, "Yes." That one word moved through the room like a fresh wind through stale cloth. Salome felt it hit her skin. Alonso's hand, resting near the edge of the bench, tightened once. Herrera did not press with triumph. He pressed with method. "Then explain to the court how the claimant now presents a bond instrument suggesting obligation contrary to that entry." The notary looked toward Julian. That look condemned more than any speech could have. Judge Beltran's voice hardened. "Answer." The old man's shoulders seemed to sag under something heavier than age. "The bond was not regularized in full course," he said. "A draft was brought to me after the fact, incomplete, lacking original support." The room rustled. The judge struck the table with his pen again for silence. The notary went on, words coming quicker now that shame had finally broken its dam. "I was told it was only to align scattered household accounts, that no harm would come, that the woman in question had no proper protector and the matter would settle quietly. He stopped, shut his eyes, and forced the rest out. "I allowed additions in the margins and the use of my prior forms where no lawful transfer had been proved." Now there it was. Naked. Ugly. Impossible to pretty up. A forged instrument dressed in notarial cloth. Julian's advocate objected at once, shouting about confusion, age, misremembering, hostile pressure. But panic had entered his voice, and panic always makes fine men sound common. Judge Beltran overrode him. Herrera asked 3 more questions, each one small and deadly. Had money changed hands? Yes, through an intermediary. Had the original declaration of free birth been inconsistent with the later bond? Yes. Had the document presented by Julian's side been created to manufacture control where the archive showed freedom? The old man covered his face for a moment before answering. Yes. If the first witness had cracked, the notary collapsed. Gasps burst from the benches. Someone near the back muttered a prayer. Tomasa, who had insisted on attending despite every warning, whispered, "May God strike liars deaf," under her breath. Salome did not move. She sat as if carved from the same hard wood as the bench beneath her, yet inside she felt something break open that had been clenched since childhood. Judge Beltran ordered the false bond set aside, the paid witness held for perjury, and the notary remanded for further inquiry. Then he turned to the matter at the heart of it all. The claimant's seizure request is void. The woman stands before this court as free, unless contrary lawful proof exists. None has been shown. This petition is dismissed. Dismissed. Such a plain word for so large a deliverance. For the first time all day, Salome turned fully toward Alonso. He did not speak. He did not need to. The look in his face was too full for speech in that room.
Julian rose with murder in his eyes and humiliation burning red under his skin. He laughed without bowing, without waiting for form, without looking back at anyone, except once, and that single glance he threw at Salome was so cold that even Father Robles noticed it and crossed himself. By the time they rode back toward the estate, the sun was already falling. Before the last light died over the hills, a stable boy came tearing up the road toward them, screaming so hard he could barely get the words out. "Don Alonso! The horse barn! The barn is on fire!" The boy's warning tore the last of the court's stale air from their lungs. Alonso did not wait for the carriage. Neither did Salome. They ran for the horses waiting in the square, skirts, coats, and dignity forgotten in the same breath.
By the time they reached the estate road, the sky ahead was already bruised with smoke. It rolled above the trees in thick black folds, ugly and fast, and under it came the sound every stable hand fears most: horses screaming in fire. The smell hit them before the gate did. Burning hay, hot pitch, singed hair, panic. When they burst into the yard, the horse barn was already half lit from within, its plank walls breathing flame through the cracks. Men were throwing buckets in wild rhythm. Women shouted for sand, for blankets, for saints. A mare had broken loose and was rearing near the well, eyes white with terror. Sparks flew high enough to kiss the balcony rail, and through all that noise came one truth at once. This was no accident of a fallen lamp. The side door had been barred from outside. Alonso saw it. Isidro saw it. Salome did not stop to name it. She heard a frantic pounding from the inner stalls and ran straight toward it. "Salome, no!" Alonso shouted, but she was already there, ripping a feed hook from the wall and slamming it against the side latch where heat had swollen the wood. The iron burned her palm through the cloth. Smoke punched into her face so hard her eyes streamed at once. Inside, the horses were madness, kicking, shrieking, smashing iron shoes against boards slick with sparks. One gelding had gone down in the far stall and was thrashing. Another had twisted its halter nearly into its own throat. For a second, the fire took the world and made it all one color. Then instinct, strength, and fury did the rest. Salome swung the hook again, splitting the side brace. A stable hand shoved beside her with an axe. Together they tore the opening wide enough to drive the nearest animals through. One bolted out wild-eyed and nearly knocked her flat. Another came sideways in blind terror. She caught the halter of the mare choking herself and cut it loose with a knife dragged from a groom's belt. Somewhere behind her, beams began to crack overhead, with the deep, hateful groan of wood giving up. That was when Alonso reached her. He plunged through the smoke with his coat thrown over his mouth and seized her by the shoulders just as a rain of burning straw dropped where she had been standing. "Out!" he roared. "Now!" She fought him for one heartbeat, trying to wrench back toward the fallen gelding, but the stable hand behind them shouted that the beast had kicked free and was scrambling toward the breach. Alonso half-dragged, half-carried her through the side opening into the yard as the roof over the inner stalls sagged and sent a burst of sparks roaring upward. People screamed. The horses burst clear one after another into the open corral, black shapes streaked orange by the blaze. Salome hit the dirt, coughing, soot-blackened, hair half loose, chest heaving hard enough to hurt. Alonso dropped to his knees beside her, both hands on her face as if he needed to confirm she was still made of flesh and not smoke. "I called you," he said, voice broken raw. "I called and there was no answer." She tried to speak and could only cough first. Then, with a mouthful of ash, she managed, "You found me." Behind them, the men finally caught one of the runners trying to slip through the back mesquite fence. He had stable tar on his sleeves and a strip of tack marked from Julian's ranch tucked under his belt. Isidro struck him to the ground before he could lie. And all at once the whole yard understood what had happened. The false papers had failed. So the spite had turned to fire. Alonso rose slowly then, soot on his face, murder in his eyes, and looked from the captured man to his mother on the gallery, to the workers huddled in the yard, to Salome, still kneeling in the dirt with smoke curling from her torn sleeve. When he spoke, he did not lower his voice for anyone. "Tomorrow," he said, "the town will hear from my own mouth who this woman is to me." Even before dawn touched the ruined barn, word had already begun to outrun the smoke. By sunrise, the fire was beaten down to smoking beams, black mud, and the bitter stink of ruin. A groom counted the horses with shaking hands. Not one had been lost. 2 were cut, 1 limped, and the mare Salome had freed stood blowing hard in the lower pen with soot on her flanks, alive, because she had chosen to go into flame when every decent reason told her to run from it. The captured man did not keep his courage long. Faced with Isidro, Father Robles, half the yard as witnesses, and the strip of tack from Julian's ranch still tucked under his belt, he confessed enough. Money had been offered. The side door had been barred. The fire was meant to punish, to frighten, to drive her out if the court had failed. When town heard that before noon, Julian's last shreds of respectability burned faster than the barn had. Alonso did exactly what he had promised in the yard. He did not hide her in a side chapel. He did not wait for gossip to settle. He sent word to the priest, to the town officials, to every neighboring house that had taken pleasure in whispering. And then he stood in the plaza after Mass, with smoke still faint in his clothes, and named her before everyone. He spoke her name, and asked her, there in the open air, to marry him. There were people who expected tears. Others expected a scene. Salome gave them neither. She looked at him in the full glare of noon, in front of the same kind of people who had measured her, mocked her, and tried to write her into bondage. And she answered with the steadiness that had carried her from the first day. "Yes," she said, "but not because the town now approves, because you stood when standing cost you." That was the true vow between them. The church only blessed it afterward. Doña Mercedes came later than the others to the wedding. Pride is stubborn, even when truth has already won. Yet she came. She sat rigid through the service, gloved hands clasped too tightly, and when it was done and the priest had spoken the final blessing, she approached her new daughter by marriage, last of all. For one long breath, it seemed she might still choose silence. Then she lowered her head and offered the family rosary for Salome to touch as a sign of acceptance. It was not warmth yet, but it was surrender, and sometimes surrender is the first honest gift a proud heart can give. Years softened what weeks had only cracked. The rebuilt barn rose stronger than before, with stone at the base where dry timber had once stood too naked to sparks. The kitchen school under the oak became a regular thing. Benito learned his letters well enough to keep accounts clean. Children came to the house in time, dark-eyed, loud, long-limbed, and impossible for anyone to sort neatly into the old foolish boxes the town once loved. Doña Mercedes, to her own surprise, became the grandmother who slipped sweets from her sleeve and corrected bad manners with terrifying precision. Tomasa lived long enough to scold those children and feed them all. Isidro died with his keys beside him and the ledgers in better order than he had found them. And whenever Salome passed the rebuilt stalls, she still laid a hand on the mare she saved first, as if remembering that some lives are won twice, once on paper and once in fire. At the edge of the yard, near the oak, the first green shoots always came through the ash-dark soil after the dry months broke. Thin at first, easy to miss if you only looked for grand things. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and keep a place for this channel. And if you want, tell me in the comments which moment you felt in your chest the most.